Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. And we're happy to have with us today for our book talk, Professor Stephen Crowley. And this is one of our series of book talks called Books at Wilson. Before we begin, I want to encourage everyone to stay up to date with publications and our websites and various activities. You can visit our website and subscribe to our two blogs, The Russia File and Focus Ukraine, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and The Russia File. If you have any questions for today's speaker, you can send them to us by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or write on our Facebook page. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. Let me begin by introducing our speaker today, Professor Stephen Crowley. He is a scholar of the politics of Russia and Eastern Europe, with a focus on labor and the political economy of the post-communist transformations. In addition to today's book, he is the editor of numerous books on Russian and Ukrainian labor issues. He has been featured in the Slavic Review, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, and the Washington Post. And today we're going to talk about his new book, Putin's Labor Dilemma, Russian Politics Between Stability and Stagnation, which is available through Cornell University Press and examines the specter of looming labor and social unrest as Russia leaders contemplate how to rejuvenate the country's struggling economy. Lastly, Professor Crowley is an alum of both the Wilson Center's fellowship program, serving as a Wilson Fellow and the Title VIII as a Title VIII short-term scholar. So with that, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Will, much appreciated. And first I might just share with you the cover of the book. I'm not responsible for the cover. This was the Cornell Press that put this together, but somebody told me that this looks like an advertisement for a Netflix series, but it's not, it's a book, I can promise you. So let me start out by just saying a few words about what I mean by Putin's labor dilemma, then sketch out some of the different sections of the book. And then I'll end with the protests that happened a year ago in Belarus, where not only were sort of college educated professionals protesting, but also joined by workers. And then to raise the question about how this dilemma might be overcome. So the labor dilemma, I would argue, is both well hidden and also fairly obvious. Russia has yet to fully reckon with the legacy of its post-Soviet industrial structures. So, I mean, in particular, large factories and working class communities. So in his book, Putinomics, Chris Miller argued that there's a hierarchy of goals at work in Russia's political economy. First, political control. Second, social stability, and third, efficiency and profit. But I think it's pretty clear that there's a contradiction in that hierarchy, that goal ranking. Political control can't rely solely on repression and propaganda, especially if the third goal, an efficient economy that provides some level of public benefit, isn't met. Yet prioritizing economic efficiency risks undermining that second goal of social stability and ultimately the first, political control. Or as I put it in the book, by preventing mass layoffs, the government can maintain social stability, but only at the cost of economic growth. And the absence of that is itself a potential threat to social stability. So hence the book's subtitle, Russian Politics Between Stability and Stagnation. Now, most of you will know that Russia's industrialization began with Stalin's massive drive in the 1930s. And then in a couple of decades after that, more than 1,000 new cities were built. Many of them were born and raised as Soviet-style company towns, with one or more industrial enterprises providing housing and whatever meager services there were. There I'm quoting Phil Taubman from some years ago. In Russian, these are sometimes referred to as city-forming enterprises. In other words, first the factory came and then you built a city around it. So the Soviet Union ended up with a coal and steel economy, where industrial enterprises were largely responsible for people's well-being, not only the workers, but people living in the cities. And after the collapse in the 1990s, you had massive privatization. And then the fear was that Russia would erupt in social explosion. But even though the downturn in Russia was longer and deeper than that experienced by the US during the Great Depression, Russia's industrial enterprises survived not with mass layoffs, but with extreme declines in wages. So here is a chart from the book. So you can see the red line there, unemployment, it certainly declined, but not dramatically and not nearly as much as GDP did, whereas wages declined even more than GDP. During the Great Depression, US unemployment reached about 25%. In Russia's, it barely reached single digits. So low unemployment, but a crisis of wage arrears. And we sometimes forget that, and you can see in 1999 here, just how low wages were. This is when Putin is appointed prime minister. So Putin came to power on a huge wave of strikes, including the so-called rail wars, where coal miners basically occupied the Trans-Siberian Railway. So then in 2000, you had the oil boom, wages obviously go up, but Russia was left with a sizable portion of its workforce in large enterprises as opposed to small and medium firms. So here you can see, realize the print is pretty low here, pretty small, but on the left, Russia, about 80% of employment in manufacturing is in large enterprises, just much more sizable than comparable, well, really many other countries. Again, extremely flexible wages. So the wages declined, then they started rising in 1999 and beyond, but in a very kind of informal way. So a lot of workers' wages go in the envelope, just what we would say under the table. A lot of employment is informal through the informal economy and so on. And all of this means very low labor productivity. So there's Russia, just two from the left, just slightly more productive than Mexico and South Africa. As Paul Krugman, speaking about productivity, he had this to say, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. So all of this keeps Russia in the middle income trap of the global economy, and really, as some have put it, addicted to oil and gas and raw materials exports. If labor is this cheap, then there's basically no incentive to invest in technology. So another thing I examine in the book to a considerable extent is Russia's monotowns. So these are single industry factories or towns. And here, this is not drawn from the book, this comes from some Russian colleagues, but you get a sense of just the many monotowns there are and how dispersed they are and so on. So officially over 300 monotowns, and there have been considerable steps by the government to avoid protests taking place in these monotowns. Now, there wasn't actually much talk about monotowns in Russia up until the 2008 crisis, and then suddenly they became a widespread concern. So in November 2008, Evgeny Guttmacher, the economist and commentator, wrote a controversial article in Vedomosti titled Novocherkassk 2009. Now, Novocherkassk, as you may know, was a town in the south of Russia when in 1962, workers who had gone on protest were shot by authorities, shot and killed. And this is something that still resonates. There was recently a feature film made in Russia about this that is basically framed as an indictment of the Soviet nomenclatura. But in many ways, one might ask, is it still, how different is it now? And this is something that still resonates. So Guttmacher's article basically sketched out a scenario where protests spread from one monotown to another till they reached Moscow. And his article in Vedomosti was cited by the extremist law, by the anti-terrorism law for inciting extremism. Now we know that Novichokov still resonates because just some months before Gantmacher's article, Vladimir Putin went to Novichokov and laid flowers at the monument of the slain workers. And just months after Gantmacher's article, so that was November 2008, I think it was May 2009, there were protests in the town of Pikolyovo, a monotown in Leningrad Oblast, where workers, not only did the factory shut down, but the town's hot water was shut off for non-payment. And the residents of the town stormed the mayor's office, and then they blockaded a major highway, caused a 400-kilometer traffic jam. And Vladimir Putin helicoptered into Pikolyovo to dress down the owners, including Oleg Deripaska. So here he is giving his glowering look. So he's clearly being the savior here. And then in a scene that became known as the bending of the oligarch, Putin demands that Deripaska come up and sign a statement that he is going to reopen the factory and re-employ the workers and so on. And then when Deripaska goes and sits down, Putin says, "Hey, give me back my pen." So he's clearly showing, you know, I'm the top guy here. But he's also showing by the bending of the oligarch that the oligarchs have a social responsibility. We are all interested together. We have a mutual interest in social stability. So what's the actual record of protest in Russia? The largest union in Russia is what I and others have called a legacy union. That is a union that's left over from the communist period. So the FNPR, the biggest union federation by far, is now closely united with United Russia, as it was even more so with the Communist Party in the past. And unions have consistently ranked down at the bottom in terms of popular trust of social institutions. Now, I've been following this pretty closely since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it wasn't that surprising that coming out of the communist period that unions were not trusted. But what's striking is that even today, they remain at the bottom. So this is not from the book because this is a Levada Center poll from just last week, I believe, or at least it was published last week. And here you can see trade unions are third from the bottom in terms of social institutions that are trusted. So well below the army, the president, the FSB, the church, and so on, just above large businesses and political parties. So they're now alternative unions, new unions that are much more militant, but these have been increasingly marginalized and repressed. Labor strikes are extremely difficult to carry out legally. And yet the irony is that while labor unions and protests are seemingly controlled by the regime, when they do break out, they are almost always wildcat. That means without union participation and therefore uncontrolled. In the US, strikes, there's more talk about strikes now. You may have noticed this in the news recently. And the argument is that because the labor market has tightened, there's more demand for labor. There's sort of less fear for workers to go out on strike. And that's one reason why we're seeing an increase in strikes. But in Russia, strikes happen not when things are good, but when things are bad. So here you can see, and this is based in work I've done together with my colleague Irina Olimpieva, and based in part on data gathered by Pyotr Bizyukov. And these are not legal strikes, these are just protests as reported by various sources and so on. But you can see the protests happen inversely with real wages. So as real wages go down, the protests go up. So workers are really striking and protesting out of desperation more than anything else. So I spend a chapter in the book talking about Tolyatti, which is Russia's largest monotown, also referred to as Russia's Detroit. It's a city of 700,000 people where until recently, 1 out of every seven residents worked directly at the auto plant, Avtovaz. And at first glance, it looked like a successful case of massive downsizing because the workforce was basically cut in half. But when one looks closer, there was sizable government efforts to prevent social upheaval. And the costly measures that they implemented while avoiding some conflicts ended up creating others in unexpected ways. So I think it's obvious that the Kremlin has a palpable fear of color revolutions, like the one that recently, well, back in 2014, chased President Yanukovych out of Ukraine. And one way to prevent that from happening is to keep society divided. So divided between social classes, divided between regions, and divided between those that have economic and social concerns from those that have political demands. So back in 2011 and 2012, when Putin and his United Russia party remained in power, partly with the help of fraudulent election margins, there were ostensibly middle-class protests that broke out primarily in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And during one of these protests, Igor Kolmanskik, a foreman at the Ural Vagonzavod factory, he spoke up on one of Putin's direct line call-in programs. And basically he said, if the militia can't handle the protests, then me and the mujiki are ready to come out and defend stability. And the state-controlled media played this up considerably, and Putin later appointed Kolmanskik to be his presidential representative for the Urals Federal District, just as a factory foreman. And this led some people to claim that Putin had survived the protests by pitting rural and Rust Belt Russia against urban and modernizing Russia. But since then, the economic conditions in Russia have taken a turn for the worse. And after a few years, Kolmanskik's Ural Vagonzavod factory was on the verge of bankruptcy. And with that, for many Russians, stability began to look like stagnation. So predictably, Putin sought to change the narrative by deepening cultural divisions, adopting more nationalistic, anti-Western rhetoric and actions, culminating with the seizure of Crimea in 2014. And yet the rally around the flag effect, while it boosted his popularity for a while, it proved short-lived, particularly as the standard of living continued to deteriorate. But in an effort to keep society divided, the Kremlin seeks to maintain a bulwark between protests centered on social and economic grievances, which are given a degree of tolerance, and protests that have explicitly political demands, which are harshly repressed. But it turns out that there's a pretty low hurdle separating economic from political protest. And we know this from the truckers' strikes that happened in trucker protests that happened in 2015, when truck drivers throughout Russia united in protest against what they saw was an illegitimate road tax. So truck drivers would seem to be, part of Putin's core social support. And they initially pleaded, "President, help us," which sounds almost exactly like the old saying, if only the Tsar knew. And that led some academic accounts to dismiss the failed politicization of the trucker protests. But when the truckers were faced with repression and then silence of their demands on state media, they became quickly radicalized. They formed their own independent union. For a time, they explicitly disavowed politics because they claimed they distrusted the political system. They distrusted political parties of every stripe. But within months, they bridged the gap from economic grievances to political protest. They called for a general strike to demand the government resign. And they advanced their own leader, the leader of their independent union, to run as a candidate against Putin for president. Now, he was predictably and harshly repressed. But I would argue that this fear that the bulwark separating economic demands from calls for political change is that might collapse is arguably the reason why Alexei Navalny is seen as so threatening. By exposing and denouncing egregious levels of corruption, Navalny's protest movement promised to unite not only the latte drinkers in major cities demanding greater freedoms, but also those preferring stronger drink in Rust Belt towns concerned with declining wages. As one trucker put it, While addressing a Navalny-inspired protest, Russia's potholed roads, the ostensible reason for the road tax, were being ruined by yachts, not by trucks. Now, the prospect that such disparate groups would unite in protest might appear far-fetched, but that's precisely what happened 1 year ago next door in Belarus. They are protests demanding that Lukashenko step down after a clearly stolen election. They were soon joined by workers in factories and workplaces across the country. Over 80 enterprises participated in these protests. And workers marched out of factory gates in uniform and were cheered by protesters in the streets. And Lukashenko himself went to factories to say, hey, you guys, you're my core supporters, right? Your protesting is to me like a stab in the back. Udar v spinu, said. And they booed him. They told him to go. We don't want you. Picture the dilemma for the security services, for the police and the militia. It's one thing to be told to go use your truncheon against a bunch of college kids who were infected by Western ideals. But imagine them being told, go crack the heads of a few workers coming out of the factory. That may be harder to pull off. And I would argue almost certainly without backing from Russia, Lukashenko would have been chased from office, just like Yanukovych was. So how does Russia get out of this dilemma? I don't have any easy answers. And frankly, getting rid of Putin is not going to solve the problem. So I call the book Putin's Labor Dilemma in part because the way Putin has sought to legitimate himself as kind of a macho guy who's one with the mujiki. But I also called it Putin's Labor Dilemma because, well, I thought it might help sell books. Really, it's Russia's labor dilemma. So imagine for a moment that the country's liberal opposition somehow united with workers and others to bring about Russia's color revolution. What might Russia look like then? One problem is that you may have removed the political power holder, but you haven't removed the economic ones, the oligarchs. That's the challenge that Zelensky in Ukraine is now facing. But the other challenge is that to have a Russia that is truly democratic means one that actually reflects the interests of the majority. And arguably the majority in Russia are not educated urban liberals. Survey data makes abundantly clear that the majority of Russians favor strong social protections rather than full-on market forces. And any painful market reforms that might be implemented to get Russia out of its middle income trap and its oil and gas addiction would need to be carefully crafted so that the pain doesn't fall disproportionately on Russia's many working class and rural communities. So here I'll end with a deliberately provocative question, just in order to prompt discussion. If you don't cushion those reforms, might a post-Putin Russia that tries to push those reforms through actually end up being less rather than more democratic? And with that, I will say thanks. I will just share with you my contacts. Feel free to send comments if you don't get questions and so forth asked, answered.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very interesting talk. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Professor Crowley, please submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. I'm going to begin with a few questions though, Steve. And my first question, talking about the failure of kind of mass protests and protests in these one company towns. To what extent do these one company towns still pursue and carry out the Soviet tradition of not only paying workers, but providing them with apartments, social benefits, holidays, etc.? And that might be a continuing reason why they don't want to break with the factory or protest the factory, because they're not only responsible for wages, but they're also responsible for all these other added benefits.
Yeah, so the short answer is yeah. So a lot of that still happens. Ostensibly, the social services were meant to be spun off to the municipalities, but as you can imagine, in these one company towns, where do you get the taxes from to run the services if not from the factories themselves? So there's clearly is some real dependence here. So this is, yeah, on the one hand, you can protest the factory, but on the other hand, everything depends upon it. So things have to get pretty bad before people protest. Now the amount of towns are varied. Some are small, some are big, some are close to other urban areas, some are totally isolated. So it partly depends on other opportunities and so on. So that's one sort of outlet that some people have, but this is a huge problem. That yeah, again, so in Piccolo, it wasn't. I mean, they closed down the factory, so that was bad enough. So they don't have work. But then when they shut off the hot water supply, you know, that was the next step. So it's all tied together, and if the factory goes, then everything goes. So that's the other part of it. I mean, how can you can't shut down the factory without basically obliterating the town in many cases, especially if they're isolated.
Again, if you have questions for our speaker, you can send them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to Twitter @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. Yes. So the second question that I have is to what extent can Putin really back away from this promise of social stability? He just ran, or the United Russia just ran on a platform of continuing social stability and providing more payments and giving away more things. So is this just kind of the trend of Russian politics that they can afford through the gas and oil economy to simply pay them off? And is this promised social stability, which you raised in your talk, is that really the key, that Putin has decided that that's what he's going to run on? That's going to be his political testament, and that he's responsible for maintaining that?
Yeah, so to a considerable extent, one of the ways that Putin has kept these groups divided that I mentioned, so let's call them the liberal oppositionists and people in Rust Belt and rural communities that might be unhappy with economic and social conditions. One way he's done that is by pointing to the 1990s. Look what happened in the 1990s. And with, you know, when I came out, you know, we created stability. Now we're maintaining stability. And clearly that seemed pretty obvious in the 2000s with the oil boom. But since then, it's been harder to make that obvious. And in fact, living standards have deteriorated. So sure, around election time, there's promises of more payments, we'll increase pensions and so on. But at some point, economic growth is suffering, living standards are suffering. They might be boosted from time to time by spikes in oil and gas prices, which is happening now. But that is just another indication of the fact that the Russian economy is stuck with a boom and bust cycle. So yeah, so the promise of social stability is important, but are you delivering it? And there's a lot of evidence now that most Russians are not terribly happy with the status quo. Again, they're not thinking in terms of fair elections necessarily, or political freedoms or human rights. And many of the problems are also localized. This is one of the problems of uniting protests. There may be protests about garbage dumps or different things about particular factories and so on. But there is the danger for the regime that these protests can accumulate and begin to spread from one place to another.
We have our first question from Karen Siegel, a former diplomat in Russia. And she asks, when we were in Yekaterinburg 2 years ago, we saw many made in Russia products featured in nice department stores. Everything from fashion clothing to earrings to cheese, etc. Russian leaders have pointed to this as Russian success story and getting around Western sanctions. Is there a new domestic production of consumer goods in Russia? Where are they? Where are they, and how do they work?
Yeah, good question. So obviously the sanctions have allowed for a kind of informal industrial policy. So, and that has boosted production. A lot of it's been agricultural products and so forth. So that's been a good thing for a time, but the challenge is you only have so much of a domestic market, and at some point you saturate that, and then where else are these goods going to be competitive beyond Russia? So this was a problem for Togliatti, for the Avtovaz factory that produced cars in the Soviet period, and then in the post-Soviet period, they continued to produce cars, but at some point they just were not the cars that people wanted to buy. So one of the protests that happened around Avtovaz, related to Avtovaz, was that when things got bad with the Avtovaz factory and the workers were threatened with layoffs, the Russian government intervened and banned the import of used cars, or at least raised tariffs for used cars. And this prevented more workers at Avtovaz from being laid off. But what it set off was protests in the Far East, where people like to import cars from Japan, because used cars from Japan were better than the new Ladas that were rolling off the factories. And then the other attempt that they tried to do to save Avtovaz was basically they privatized it to Renault. And so Avtovaz, which used to be Russia's biggest car producer, is just now part of a multinational corporation that is seeking to make profits and not necessarily trying to employ Russian workers. And it only looks to the Russian car market as long as there's enough demand for people to buy cars. So I have in the book a graph that marks the price of oil and the demand for cars in Russia, and they are perfectly correlated. So when there's an oil boom, there's demand for cars to be made in Russia. But when the boom goes down, when it goes bust, so do the car factories.
And if you have questions for Professor Crowley, you can send them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or write on our Facebook page. Here's a question from William Courtney, retired US ambassador. Could the Kremlin lessen the risk of labor backlash by allowing a wider role for the private economy, thereby likely increasing productivity and wages in the private sector? The role of state enterprises and their bloated employment was reduced.
Yeah, so I think that is the dilemma right there. So private enterprises might be interested in increasing productivity, but they're not necessarily interested in maintaining employment. So that's the sort of the nub of the problem. So again, this Avtovaz factory, this huge factory that had employed 100,000 workers, obviously way overmanned in Western economic terms. And they brought in it was actually Swedish CEO, Bo Anderson, but Russians refer to him as that American. So here comes that American. And what he did was he just slashed the number of workers. So he tried to make it more productive. And in some ways he was successful in making it more productive, but he cut the workforce down so far that eventually the Russian government intervened and fired him. Part of the problem was that he was taking these steps right around the same time as this Crimea is ours euphoria. So this big nationalist backlash in Russia. And here you have this guy, the Swedish CEO, who they referred to as the American, was all of a sudden firing Russian workers, and that did not go over well. So maybe what I would say is not simply reducing the role of the state in the economy. That might or might not be good, but I think what needs to happen is The workers themselves need to feel a little bit more empowered. They need to actually have trade unions or other means to be able to assert their grievances, and then to be able to bargain over, okay, so we need to make this place more productive. How are we going to do that? How many people have to be laid off? We know that there's going to be trade-offs here. What are you going to do to compensate the laid off workers and so on? But make it a process of negotiation, not just sort of top-down paternalism, and then Putin helicoptering in and putting out fires when he needs to.
Going back to one of your original points, Steve, you talked about the crunch on efficiency and profit. Does Russia really concern itself with profit and efficiency? Is this one of its goals? I mean, it's a stated goal, and Putin always kind of uses his annual address to talk about the excess number of inspections and how they're limiting investment and small and medium-sized businesses. But to what extent does that even interest Russia?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I quoted Chris Miller before, Putinomics. There's political control, there's social stability, and then, you know, it's there, but it's number 3, economic efficiency. But the problem is that you can, as I said, you can only maintain social stability for so much if you have continually declining living standards. Again, the current spike in oil and gas prices might help delay things for a while, but at some point you need to reckon with these challenges. And obviously, I'm not talking so much about the oligarchs or sort of rival elites. That's, you know, others have written about that extensively. But for anybody that, you know, any sort of authoritarian figure in power has to be concerned not only with the rival elites, but with protest from below as well, as we've seen in various color revolutions. So again, to restate, yeah, economic efficiency is clearly not the first goal, but nonetheless, without some focus on that, you start threatening those other goals, social stability and political control.
This question is from Thomas Brewer. At least in the process industries, much of what laborers once did is done better by computers that are monitored by a few skilled operators. Higher and better quality output is achieved with smaller raw material inputs. To what extent is this sort of modernization being blocked, and how much does it hurt?
Yeah, so it was that's one of the problems of this labor productivity that I mentioned. So labor productivity is low in Russia, and that's tied in part to this lack of modernization or computerization technology and so forth that I mentioned. But arguably, it's more a function of low wages, because wages are just so low and so flexible upwards and downwards, that there is just very little incentive for even profit-minded entrepreneurs to invest in technology. I mean, the reason to invest in costly computers that, you know, allow you to shed some workers is that you'll save some money by doing that. But if the cost of labor is just simply so low, so flexible, and workers have basically so few you know, rights to defend themselves, then there's very little incentive to invest in that kind of technology, that sort of modernization. And then even more so when you don't allow the sorts of political freedoms, you don't allow workers to, you know, to vent their concerns except in sort of illegal protests and uprisings and so on, then there is limited incentive for the government to encourage that sort of investment that will lead to labor shedding. You need to find some viable outlet for workers that are being let go.
Again, if you have questions, email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. Contact us by Twitter at Kennan Institute, or write on our Facebook page. Our next question comes from Don Van Atta from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he asked the description of the situation: wages, SMEs, uncompetitive products, mono cities. Sounds like 1993 all over again. are there other alternatives, or have the alternatives simply narrowed?
Well, hello, Don Van Atta. Yeah, good question. So yeah, much of this is are legacies, I would say, certainly from the Soviet period, but also from how Russia survived the 1990s. I mean, again, this is just really quite striking that you went through a depression that was longer and deeper than the US, and yet you basically, there were very few large-scale bankruptcies. Even today, I mean, there's a few exceptions. There was the limousine factory, the ZIL factory in Moscow, but there obviously there's much more of a labor market to absorb workers that were shed, and obviously even the real estate in Moscow is so valuable. There was the Baikalsk paper and pulp mill that was closed, but partly because the Lake Baikal was going to be destroyed, and there was a huge back and forth. It was closed, then was reopened again, and so on. But other than that, it's very hard to find examples of large factories that have been just shut down. Now, some of them have been modernized. The metals industry, by and large, does quite well, partly because it gets subsidized gas and electricity and so forth. And so that makes it competitive for exports. Again, it depends on the boom and bust cycle, because prices rise and fall in the metals industry. But yeah, it's surprising in some ways. And again, it's surprising that through the boom and bust cycle. So if factories weren't closed or sufficiently modernized and during the collapse of the 1990s, what about the boom of the 2000s? But then, of course, things were good. You could just simply keep these places afloat. You didn't have to worry about them sort of, going up in social explosions. So I think that explains a great deal of that continuity from the 1990s you referred to.
When I practiced law in Moscow, this is about 15, 20 years ago, just trying to fill out a bankruptcy application, getting all the approvals to actually declare a company bankrupt was very, very time consuming. And if you were a foreign company trying to do it to a Russian company, very, very expensive. So I haven't followed bankruptcy law recently, but I can imagine that still it's just very, very difficult from an administrative standpoint to actually declare a company bankrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's just sort of the legal question of bankruptcy and so on. And then there's actually closing up shop and just massive layoffs. And that's
right.
often
In the 1990s, there was all this talk about foreign investment, but I assumed that was going to be a driver of modernization. I assume that has dried up considerably in the aftermath of sanctions and Crimea.
Well, I think even before then, I think there was always question about property rights and so on in Russia, and how reliable were contracts, how reliable were investments once they were made. There was a nationalization of some of the oil deals that were done in the 1990s when the economy was much more liberal and so on. So, but certainly since sanctions, since Crimea, much less than that. Again, there was significant, for a time, there was significant investment in the auto industry. Ford, as well as Renault and some of the others came in, but they did it in the wake of the oil boom, when there was a demand in Russia. So within the European market, 140 some people, that's not a small sort of thing. But again, they look primarily for just producing cars for the Russian market, maybe in Central Asia or some other places that they could spin them off to. But and then when the oil boom collapsed, and then when the economy started shrinking, they just began pulling out. So there was partly the political climate, are our investments safe from somebody grabbing them, but also with the boom and bust cycles, is it worth it?
This is a question from Victoria Pardini. Can you speak on so-called dying cities in Russia? Are there plans being made by the Kremlin to try and improve these conditions for those workers who are being forced out of their home regions because the factories are leaving monotowns, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, there has been substantial migration. There's much of it in the 1990s, particularly say from the far north and the far east and so on. There are still, in some places, there are sizable numbers of shift workers. So in some places like the mining town of Vorkuta up above the Arctic Circle, one thing that's happened is a lot of shift workers have come in to, to work for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, and then they leave for a similar amount of time and then come back again and so on. But very few of the towns are actually dying in the sense that they're closing up altogether. They still somehow hang on. And even in the far north, some of the colleagues who've looked at small villages in the far north find that, oddly enough, people don't always want to leave. I mean, these look like the most inhospitable places on the planet. Why would anybody want to live up above the Arctic Circle? But people who have lived there, who talk about coming up during the Soviet years, it's like, well, this was back when labor was valued, and we thought, look, we built this city with our hands, and we don't really want to leave. This is where our ties are. This is home for us. It keeps pulling us back in, people would say. And so in some cases, the Russian government, with the help of the World Bank and others, tried to incentivize people to leave these small towns in the far north. And what the older generation ended up doing was they ended up staying there, even though they weren't working there anymore because they were retired, and they gave the money to their kids, like, okay, well, you can go, but we are staying here because this is home. This is all we know. And so many of these places are shrinking, but they're not disappearing entirely. And in most cases, these factories are still, they're still around in some fashion. They're struggling somehow, but they're still operating. And as Cliff Gaddy put it, the lights are on. So they're keeping the lights on somehow.
Going back now to the recent example of Belarus and the example of workers and intelligentsia uniting. What do you think Putin's lessons are from Belarus? Obviously, I would think that, a crackdown and going after selected industries and selected punishment, I think maybe Putin has found that is just the way to deal with all these protests. And the foreign agent law is a part of that, but I think Putin might have come out fairly assuaged and persuaded that his strategy of selective enforcement, selective criminalization, is working too.
Yeah, perhaps. Though I think in some ways you could draw the opposite conclusion, because if you think about it, so if we think about why weren't workers protesting? One would be repression. Two would be the lack of trade unions, anything like that. But in Belarus, high repression. Trade unions that actually defended workers, no, basically not. And yet they came out in just massive force. And I think that what Putin, he must realize that, well, this guy Lukashenko, so he's a bit of a cartoon character, he's a caricature of a dictator. That's one problem, but he's also been in power, 5 years longer than Putin has? Is there an expiration date? And I think that the more you repress, the more you tighten, the more things get worse rather than better economically and socially and so on, the more that people begin to think like, well, who is responsible for this? And particularly when you are controlling things under this, you're being more repressive, you are becoming more and more control over the economy and so on. People in Belarus at some point, including workers, just began to realize the problem is him. He's got to go. That's the only explanation. I mean, what unites the workers and the, the college educated, the young people and so on. It's him. So I can imagine that Putin isn't coming to that realization in some ways. And so you can continue to tighten and tighten, but you may actually be making things harder and harder for yourself. And I think Putin's one of the other dilemmas that Putin faces is that he doesn't really have an exit ramp. What is the way to where's my soft landing? How do I parachute off into my fabulous mansion, dacha, whatever. Anyway.
Yes, I think he just said essentially that changes of power are very destabilizing, and he doesn't recommend them as well. So, that sound like a leader who was dreaming of fading into the sunset. Another question from Victoria Pardini: can you speak about how United Russia uses teachers' unions to shore up support for encouraging people to vote? Are certain industries more typically pro-United Russia because of these promises versus more inclined to protest for better conditions?
Yeah, so good question. So the FNPR that I mentioned, the big union federation that is a legacy union, it's basically was the old communist era union, now refashioned as an ostensibly free union. It is very close, its hierarchy is very close to United Russia. But on the ground in workplaces, it's really pretty ineffectual. As I said, as I showed the slides, so many people just distrust trade unions. I mean, the fact that here are the organizations that would ostensibly be able to represent the interests of a huge portion of the population, that might be able to help, defend their interests, improve their living standards and so on. And they're just slightly more trusted than large enterprises and political parties. But the Kremlin certainly does, and Russia certainly does try to use these still as kind of transmission belts, as they were called in the Soviet period, to try to mobilize people. So to try to use, workplace voting. Timothy Fry and his colleagues have demonstrated how the Kremlin has used both incentives and threats in workplaces, and they found in particular monotowns are vulnerable to this for getting out the vote. Your voting depends on your job depends on your turning out to vote, sort of thing. To put it simply, they can't necessarily control who you vote for, but the message there is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Teacher unions have been mixed. So there are also some teacher unions that have, and public sector unions that have been pretty protest prone and pushed back against austerity measures and downsizing and so forth. On the other hand, as Bryn Rosenfeld and others have pointed out, often these public sector workers, because of their dependence on the government, sort of defy the impression that many people have that the middle class is the group that will push for democratic reforms. And as Rosenfeld points out, that because these budget sector workers, the budgetniki, are dependent on the government, many of them can end up being some of the strongest supporters of the regime, simply because of that dependence.
To what extent are workers kind of off the books in Russia? Migrant laborers, people from the former Soviet Union, who want to stay kind of below the radar surface, and therefore are not inclined to protest because they don't want to be noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. So Russia is very dependent on migrant labor. Absolutely. And so, yeah, they want to stay underneath the radar. And interestingly enough, the regime wants to kind of keep them under the radar because it needs them economically, but it also doesn't want to face the anti-immigrant backlash that we've seen in the US and Western Europe and so on. So it has to kind of balance things that way. But there is a lot of informal labor, even among Russian citizens themselves. So again, a lot of the pay that workers get is so-called in the envelope. It's bonuses that are paid in cash. So you're very dependent on your supervisor to make sure that you get that benefit. Again, it rises and falls with economic conditions. And then there's a lot of work that just happens in the informal economy, a significant amount. And this is one way that people survive in these Rust Belt towns. So you may get something from the factory, but you might work, you might moonlight as a plumber or a taxi driver or something like that. And all that is the way that folks survive. But you end up being in a kind of isolated way, and keeping your head down and so
on. Our last question comes from Yu Zhang, who asks, can you talk a little bit more about the comparison between the Russian monotowns and the Rust Belt cities in the United States? To what extent are they similar or different?
All right, good question, Yue. Yeah, so I mean, one interesting thing is just the different cycles that, when we're thinking in particular of company towns for a moment. So the monotowns are sometimes referred to as company towns. But in the United States, company towns sort of flourished in the late 19th century and maybe into the first part of the 20th century, and many of them simply disappeared. But in the Soviet Union and then in Russia, they started in the 1930s. Togliatti really wasn't fully underway Avtovaz factory into the early 1970s. So kind of like a different historical cycle in a way. And I think that some Russian Rust Belt cities, some of the bigger cities, try to draw lessons from places like Pittsburgh or Glasgow in the UK, the Ruhr Valley in Germany, and so on. And there are some lessons that you can draw there. But one of the challenges that's faced in Russia is the lack of agglomeration. So you have that in some places. One of the previous questioners mentioned Chelyabinsk. So in the Urals, there may be enough a kind of agglomeration that you can tie some of these communities together with a bit more transportation and so on. But in other places, they're just so isolated that it's hard to transition a town in Siberia into a sort of Pittsburgh that is now dependent on the health industry and universities and so on. And many of them are much smaller as well, so both more isolated and smaller.
So I have one last question, and this deals with the question about keeping the population divided and trying to separate political protests from economic protests. And I'm curious how Russia classifies these protests so that they can maintain that distinction, because clearly all economic protests, to one extent or another, can quickly become political. So how do they make this division, and is it really an apt description of the protest movement in Russia?
Yeah, so I argue that it isn't, that you're quite right, that these quickly can move from one to the other for various reasons. Some people refer to a discursive divide that is placed between the economic and social protests and political protests. But protests over, say, a garbage dump or something like that, or even protests that happen because workers are not getting paid in a factory, it doesn't meet with immediate repression. But what sometimes happens is that the first thing to do is that the factory owners or the local government tries to ignore the situation, and either it goes away or the workers feel like we need to escalate, we need to get attention, we need to make sure at least the regional governor is focusing on this, if not the state media and so on. So we need to escalate in order to be heard. So I think you're right, though. There's a lot of evidence that this can be quickly breached from one to the other, partly because the government has its hands in so much of economic activity. It's in control of so many of the social benefits and so on that not only workers, but pensioners and others receive. So one of the ways that protests break out and get quite wide very quickly is when the government implements a change that impacts a huge category of people. So think about the monetization of social benefits in, was it 2005, and all of a sudden pensioners all throughout Russia spontaneously all went out on strike or protest rather. Same thing with the truckers. I mean, all of a sudden there's change in this road tax, and you had truckers from Dagestan and Chita all of a sudden talking to each other when they'd never communicated before, but they were all hit by the same tax. So that's one way that, and again, they became quickly politicized and quickly radicalized.
Well, thank you, Steve. The book is Putin's Labor Dilemma, Russian Politics Between Stability and Stagnation, which is available through Cornell University Press. I'd like to thank Steve for his excellent presentation and our audience today for joining us. And we look forward to having you at our next Kennan Institute event. So thanks so much, Steve.
Sure, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for attending.